So I wonder whether 2010 may be more likely now. But you know, Adam, political journalists do not make predictions because we always get them wrong.
No, we draw analogies.
We draw analogies. And we've had a text from someone who says we're in such an odd period, politically speaking. Not sure there are any useful parallels with previous elections. There's a deficit of optimism and political philosophy, which I sort of think is what we were talking about before when we were talking about ambition and projecting that idea that you are the next party of government. That's not necessarily happening in the Labour Party right now.
Or indeed in the Conservative Party.
Exactly.
I mean,
yeah.
You know, Boris Johnson's big appeal was he was an upbeat sort of character. Rishi Sunak is managerial, likes to take it steady, and guess what? So does Keir Starmer. So actual inspiration is not there. And of course, this actually ties in with a general disillusionment with politicians.
And people in the country feeling a bit fed up,
Well, I mean, nothing like the enthusiasm, for example, that there was for Tony Blair or indeed for David Cameron. Let's dive in and look at a couple of the previous elections. Let's start with 1974. Now, in 1974, which was the last time the UK hosted Eurovision on someone else's behalf, there actually were two elections which resulted with Harold Wilson back on the steps of number 10.
We've got a job to do. We can only do that job as one people, and I'm going right in to start that job now.
Now, well, why were there two elections?
Oh, well, the first election in 1974 in February led to I think it was a hung poll from memory. It was called by Ted Heath on the expectation that he'd win, and to much surprise, I think amongst the country, he didn't manage that off. The Conservatives campaigned on the question of who governs, and the answer came back from the electorate, not you. And so the Labour came to power, but with really not much control in Parliament. And so by October, Harold Wilson, having shored up the government's position, it's seen improvements in the government approval and in his own ratings, went back to the country. Again, didn't win a commanding result, but it slightly improved Labour's position. But on one level, I like to say to people about drawing historical analogies, it's important to remember just how much British politics has changed over this period. That was a period, although the Liberal Democrats were actually doing quite well, the Liberal Party as it was then was doing quite well in that period. It was a period dominated by class politics and the two main parties, and voters were much more stable in their allegiances.
Now, Wilson actually did it twice, didn't he? He had to call two elections close together. In the 1960s, he didn't quite get the control he wanted, and it happened again in the 1970s. What about the analogy possibly with Keir Starmer? On balance, is he likely, if he does win the next election, to not win it that comfortably?
Well, I think we have to be realistic. Although Labour's seeing huge poll leads lately, the two factors you would say count against them coming to office with the sort of majority Blair had in 97. The first is simply that the electoral geography is not in Labour's favour these days. The distribution of its vote across the country is much less efficient. It's piled up huge majorities especially in urban areas, university towns, those sorts of areas, and so it faces first of all a huge challenge on that front, and obviously compared to 1997, where Tony Blair was building upon a relatively narrow loss in 1992. Labour took a really big beating, as we know, in 2019, and so it has a long way further back to come. And so, analogies with Wilson are interesting because actually Wilson was a modestly, popular politician, at times, a popular politician, but nothing like the sort of stratospheric approval ratings that Tony Blair had in 1997.
Now, speaking of that, people say very often, until recently, the conversation was: is this like the 1992 election? Or is it like 1997? Let's listen first of all to 1992.
And certainly not any part of any proposed horse trading with any other party. When we form the majority government, I'm certain that the process that I inaugurated will continue and will meet with public satisfaction.
But when you started the process 2 years ago, you had the coming general election in mind, and the possibility of the need of Liberal cooperation about PR.
Well, as it happened, at the time that I started it, we were running 10 and 12% ahead in the polls.
You knew that wouldn't last.
Well, sounds familiar. There's the Labour leader ruling out a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. I think I've heard that somewhere before recently. And of course, it was a big disappointment for Labour that they lost in 1992. John Major won unexpectedly for many, for the Conservatives holding the power that he'd taken over from Margaret Thatcher. And then there was 97, and this is what Keir Starmer's hoping for.
I stand here before number 10 Downing Street. I know the huge responsibility that is upon me and the great trust that the British people have placed in me.
Okay, then 92 or 97 as an analogy. Which do you go for, Will?
Well, I mean, I think on one level we're a little between the two. Because I mean, 1992 is a really good lesson for us in remembering that the polls can be wrong. The polls have historically tended to overestimate Labour's support by a few points. Not always. Didn't happen in 2017. And so one of the reasons 1992 was a surprise to many people was not only the exit poll was slightly off, suggesting a hung parliament, but also just the polls in the run-up had suggested that Labour was slightly ahead. That said, if you look into the fundamentals for 1992, Neil Kinnock didn't have good approval ratings. They were worse than John Major's. The government didn't have high approval ratings, but it wasn't actually as bad as the approval ratings that Heath had in 74 in February, Callaghan had in 79. And whereas actually if we look today, Starmer is still ahead on in terms of approval compared to Rishi Sunak, albeit narrowly, does lead marginally on Best Prime Minister, and Labour does have a bigger lead in voting intention polls, a considerable lead, 16% at the moment. And so you would say that thinking this is going to be just like 1992 would also be wrong, just as believing that Labour is going to end up with a huge majority, I think would be hugely over egging their position compared to the actual challenges they face.
Now, another one everyone's talking about is the possibility of Keir Starmer as kind of David Cameron in the lead up to 2010.
Our country has a hung parliament where no party has an overall majority, and we have some deep and pressing problems, a huge deficit, deep social problems, and a political system in need of reform. For those reasons, I aim to form a proper and full coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. I believe that is the right way to provide this country with the strong, the stable, the good and decent government that I think we need so badly.
Any chance, Will, that we'll hear a similar message from Keir Starmer?
Well, I think of the cases we've talked about, certainly 92 and 97, 2010 at the moment looks like a slightly closer analogy in the sense that David Cameron was, marginally ahead of Gordon Brown on Best Prime Minister ratings, not hugely, but was a more popular figure relatively. Actually had a sort of bigger lead in terms of approval ratings than Starmer does over Sunak, and the Conservatives were ahead as the best party on economic issues, and also faced actually at that time a more challenging electoral geography. The Conservatives' vote has become much more efficiently distributed since 2010. So if we are to draw historical analogies, having cautioned against it, 2010 does seem to be a closer analogy, while also recognising that Labour is probably at the present slightly further ahead of where Cameron was. Certainly, I think at the moment, if the polls were returned as a general electoral result, we would see a Labour majority. But we're certainly going to be closer to 2010 than 1997, I think.
Will Jennings, thank you. Now, Kate, we've got Will Jennings there going for 2010. I mean, this is something in the Westminster bubble people talk about all the time. Have you got any particular analogy?
I previously said I thought 92 because I thought that the Conservatives would just about do it, partly because of what was happening in Scotland. But I said that at the start of the year before what we've seen happen to the SNP. So I wonder whether 2010 may be more likely now. But Adam, political journalists do not make predictions because we always get them wrong.
No, we draw analogies.
We draw analogies. And we've had a text from someone who says we're in such an odd period, politically speaking. Not sure there are any useful parallels with previous elections. There's a deficit of optimism and political philosophy, which I sort of think is what we were talking about before when we were talking about ambition and projecting that idea that you are the next party of government. That's not necessarily happening in the Labour Party right now.
Or indeed in the Conservative Party.
Exactly,
I mean,
yeah.
you know, Boris Johnson's big appeal was he was an upbeat sort of character. Rishi Sunak is managerial, likes to take it steady, and guess what? So does Keir Starmer. So
Yeah.
actual inspiration is not there. And of course, this actually ties in with a general disillusionment with politicians.
And people in the country feeling a bit fed up, yeah.
Whereas, I mean, nothing like the enthusiasm, for example, that there was for Tony Blair or indeed for David Cameron.